We're back with the final video in this series on the Seirra Radio controller. If you've missed any of the other 3 videos, I'll leave links in the description. In this video, I'm joined by George KJ6VU and Mike VA3MW from FlexRadio to discuss the elements of a remote station, the combination of hardware and software, and how to manage a club station with dozens of members. Hey, we're back today with George KJ6VU and special guest Mike Walker VA3MW from FlexRadio. Guys, I'm really glad you're here. Today we're going to really kind of dive into building the ideal remote station. And Mike, I know you've been doing this for years. So let's start with you and tell us a little bit about your background with everything remote.
Well, I started this, it's 20 years ago now, when I moved in Toronto from an area that was urbanly quieter than normal to an area that was urbanly less quieter. And you know what, if you've ever moved, right? Oh, I got to get back on the air. So you throw a wire in a tree, you bring some coax in, and you go to 40 meters because 40 meters at night always works. Couldn't hear anything. So I thought the band was dead. So this goes on for a couple of days, and I phoned somebody. What's going on in 40? He goes, oh, I don't know. I just work like North Korea. I knew he was kidding, but you get the idea. And that got me going down the remote path because my spouse, my ex-YL, had a summer property. So we get up there, and then I started building a ham station, which meant I could use it on the weekend. Well, that was great, but I'm only there on the weekend. And that got me down the remote path. In the early days was a TS480. Once we got internet, a ham radio deluxe in client server mode, which generally worked fairly well, and Skype. And I did that for a long number of years, almost 10. The TS480 worked well with ham radio deluxe. It was an average receiver, and I liked our TTY, and it was terrible at it. And then, but 2011, FlexRadio started their 6000 series of radios. And getting them out, now the 8000 and now the Aurora, all based on the same platform. And I remember talking to our CTO, Steve Hicks, and 5AC. Now, I'm just a ham operator at that day. I'm just a customer like anybody else. And in a lot of ways, I'm still just a customer. And I said, Steve, what can I do on this LAN connector on the back? And he said, everything. And I sort of got the idea. But of course, now, as George has learned and others have learned, you can do everything. Everything passes through that network connector. Because back then, Flex got into the path of divorcing the display and the knobs from the RF deck. We don't have to be sitting in front of the coax anymore. In fact, there's no need. And it just got better with their SmartLink tool, which is as complicated to set up as a Gmail account for remote access to my radio. And then thanks to Internet of Things and then George's station controller, the ability to turn things on and off remotely, and things like Node Red and Tailscale and all these simple things to plug a solution together. It's just so easy today. So that's the short path. I just happen to live every layer of it just got easier. It just got easier. It just got easier. And every year I'd update my remote station and more stuff would come out of the cabinet and end up on the floor, that I didn't need anymore. I'm going to rebuild it. And last year, same thing happened again. That's the sort of the short story.
That's the short story. Well, yeah. And George, let's kind of dive in. Let's talk about the elements of a remote station. What are we looking at here?
So a remote station is just like any ordinary station, but you have to have some extra stuff to make it viable to be remote. So if you go back, like Mike, in your description of your station 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you had to do so much stuff to make that work. And it was a real DIY project. And I think that's great for the few people who really want to do that. But it's a lot of work, and you got to figure a lot of stuff out, and everything's a one-off. And I think now there's a lot of people that want to do remote, and there's more and more ways to do it with gear that's off the shelf. And that gear kind of boils down into a few key pieces. There's the radio itself, which is the thing that everybody thinks about, right? So everybody thinks about the remote controlled radio, and you can remote control most of the modern radios, but some are really built for that. So in my experience, the Flex is super great for that. And the others some are pretty good and some are more difficult. But once you figure out how to remotely control the radio, the next thing you need to do is figure out how to remotely control everything else, because just being able to change frequency and mode, while that's essential, is not the end of the story. So the minimum you need to do is.
Well, George's doing that. Look at you actually hit a point right there. I was just going to say that.
Yeah.
Imagine everything on your shelf in front of you. At some point in time, you're going to need to turn it off and on.
Exactly. Sorry about the interrupt. but you have to turn things on and off for safety reasons, but also for legal reasons, because if you have a remote transmitter, you need to be able to shut it down if something goes haywire. But beyond that, there's a bunch of other stuff that you want to be able to do. You want to switch antennas, you want to measure the power, you want to turn an amplifier on, you want to check the temperature of the rack of equipment, or you name it. There's so many things, and that really becomes a whole project to figure that out. So thing number one is remote the radio. Thing number two is remote everything that sits around the radio. So those are really the two big things that you have to do to remote your individual station. And then I'd say the third thing is, if you're going to take that remote station and make it available to a group of users, let's say a club station, then there's a bunch of other stuff you have to figure out. How do I schedule availability of the station? How do I provide access to several different people? How do I be able to shut things on and off and not have them switching things they shouldn't be? So there's kind of another layer of administration infrastructure that you need to make all that work.
Right. And so, okay, so let's get into it a little deeper. Let's talk about the ideal combination of hardware and software that makes this deployable. I'll let either one of you guys pick that up.
Well, I think you need to sketch out what you're thinking of doing for a station. If you're going to run a station with a multi-band antenna like a HF6V, which happens to be one of my favorite verticals, and a single coax, it becomes really simple because you don't have to rotate anything. The only thing you may want to do is figure out a way to ground the antenna, because there is no application yet that, in lightning world, like some of us are in, you're supposed to disconnect all cables from the radio, put it in the closet, and then it's safe from lightning. But of course, there is no app that throws the coax out the window. So we ground and do things like that. But that's the simple way. And I think that's where anybody who's going to do remote, start there and get on the air and do a multi-band vertical and keep it simple, and then slowly build up. And George, you've probably seen this as well. I've seen so many people have this huge, wonderful, great idea, and they try to build it all at once, and then they get frustrated with it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think start simple is important. And I think the absolute minimum things, you want an antenna switch, like you said, Mike, to either switch from the antenna to a dummy load or antenna to ground. I would say 90% of the people I talk to usually have at least two antennas. They have maybe a vertical and a wire, or a Yagi and a vertical or something. So it's usually at least two antennas and a dummy load, but you also need power on and off. That could be turning the AC on and off to a power supply. It could be turning the DC on and off to the radio. It could be a soft radio control, like in the case of the Flex, where you can just take a low voltage pull to ground signal and turn the radio on and off. So you do need some way to turn the radio on and off. I'd say beyond that, the next thing you want to do is monitor some key vital signs like the power supply voltage or a temperature. And the reason those things are important is because if you're remote and you key the transmitter and something doesn't quite work right, you need to diagnose what's going on. And so the first things you're going to ask is my power supply working? Is the voltage coming out of the supply steady and what it should be? Are things overheating? Are things turned on? Those kind of questions come up. So those are kind of the most bare minimum things, controlling the radio and those few physical things around the station. And like almost everything, once you figure that out, some people may just stop there, and that's fine. But a lot of people will get that working and then say, well, like, what else can I do? Or they'll talk to their buddy who's like, okay, I just put up a Yagi and I've got a rotor on it, so I want to point the antenna, or I want to switch between different radios, or I want to turn the power amplifier on and on, and it just kind of grows from there and goes on and on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really neat just to see all the things that are out there today. I have an Arco rotor controller. You can literally tell VNC into that thing from anywhere in the world with your phone or whatever, and turn that antenna or make a change in the menu. It's just so simple today. So
the other thing I'd mention too, by the way, is once you get this set up, I don't think a lot of people really think about it this way, but a lot of people start with, I want to remote my radio because I'm traveling, I've got a summer home or whatever it might be. But once you have that set up, you also realize I could be just anywhere in the house, so you could actually use your remote station as your station all the time. So you could be in the kitchen, you could be in the den, you could be out in the garage, and be operating your station from absolutely anywhere. So it
Heck,
really is useful.
on our way down to Orlando, I was doing FT8 from the airplane.
I mean, literally, I can walk around the house because I have the Flex 8600 over there. I can literally walk around the house and play with and do anything I want to on this.
Yeah, it's like a good friend of ours. He is always making contacts on his phone. You know, he's like at the store in the parking lot waiting for his XYL or whatever, and he's like, you know, making FT contacts from the phone.
Like I said, divorcing the display and the knobs from the RF deck.
Yeah. The funny thing is,
it's here.
The funny thing is, almost every modern radio is actually built that way inside. They may not split it apart physically and package it that way, but that's kind of the way everything is architected. So the neat thing about the Flex is that that's the way you get it. I mean, it actually comes separated if you want it that way. So it makes that sort of radio server concept really simple. But we see that in other brands too. So Elecraft, same thing. You know, you can run the RF deck from the control surface, completely different. And other radios are kind of built that way, but they're still in a single box. So we don't see that quite as much from others. But that's definitely the direction.
Absolutely. So Mike, you touched on this earlier, but let's dive in a little deeper about how easy it is to plug and play today versus maybe 10, 20 years ago.
Well, 20 years ago, or pretty much with any other radio brand, you need to have some networking experience. Now, the home network and the internet have become that conduit for the display and the knobs. And if you're not aware of what goes on behind the covers, because you've never heard the term TCP/IP, but everything sort of has an address like a phone number, and the data moves between, fortunately, pretty quickly. Actually, rapidly quickly today. It's almost at the speed of light. But back then, and you needed to be able to log into your router. You needed to make changes in your router, things called port forwarding. Your radio becomes a server. And not to say that is a scary term, but that means you need to figure out a way how to call it, how to connect to it, how to get the two endpoints together. And so that was not hard for us really geeky guys, because we probably did it at work and something. We did a couple of port forwards. We bought a hard-coded IP address, or we used Dyn DNS, and all these things are probably, if they're foreign to you, don't worry about it, sort of thing today. When advertisement here, when Flex came along to set up SmartLink and remote, they recognized that this is foreign to probably 90% of our ham operators about how to do this. So they built SmartLink, which is a user ID you log into, and behind the covers, if you want me to explain at a block level, what happens is you turn the radio on, it calls our servers, and it tells it what address it's on, what IP address it's on. I don't care what it is personally, but my server does. And then I log on from the airplane, the train, or whatever, and I say, I just want to log into my radio. And SmartLink on my end goes over to our servers, which are on AWS at Amazon. Hey, where's Mike's radio? It's at this address. He goes, thanks. Disconnects from AWS and calls the radio directly for a peer-to-peer connection, which is what we all want, because that's the lowest latency. There's no man in the middle. And we're really not kidding to say it's about as easy to set up as a Gmail account. You create a login, which is your email address, a unique password, and you have to sit beside the radio when you do it for the first time, because they want to make sure you actually physically have the radio. And then you got to hit the push-to-talk switch on a microphone, and you're done. And you never have to worry about it again.
It's just
worldwide.
Easy.
It really is.
I think you one of the things when you get into this remote control stuff, it's not obvious until you try to build out a station how much work's involved. And I think in a way that Flex has done the most remarkable job of making it just out of the box, easy to do. And if you look at the other major manufacturers, they make wonderful radios, but they're not, the remote control is kind of an afterthought. And they'll present a serial port or a Ethernet port, but everything else is more cumbersome. Either the software is kind of minimal, or it was like a feature they added to a very good radio, as opposed to building it in from the beginning to make the whole experience natural. So I think that's really the remarkable thing about the Flex radios.
Mike, George brings up a point. When you build your station before with your ICOM, because you and I've used pretty much every hardware out there, George as well, you had to decide if I had peripherals like an amplifier or antenna switches, and I wanted to do any automation. I had to decide what way that other device was going to receive the band changes, which is usually the most important thing. And often it was a Windows computer stuck in the middle, right? So we used our logging program, N1MM or whatever to send those commands. In the ICOM infrastructure, they use CIV to send them to devices, and that generally worked. And then there's BCD and all these other methods. One thing Flex did is add the ability to have as many of those hardware ports on the back of the radio with an inexpensive USB to RS-232 or serial adapter, which sends it out in Kenwood data, which is arguably one of the more stable, most implemented CAT control available. So you can have a whole pile of these plugged in the back of the radio, one to control the amp, one to control the tuner, and it sort of does a better job of integrating the solution so that when I connect to the radio and I go from 80 to 20, the radio sends that band information to the external device. And I don't need to have a PC managing that. Now, the geeky guys like us have all got around and done things like Node-RED and a whole bunch of other Pi stuff, but that's the geeky guys, not the, I just want to, like George said in the beginning, yeah, I can do it, but you know what? I just want to get home and use it.
Well, I think
and I'm there too.
One of the advantages of that approach, Mike, is from the standpoint of a developer, if people are going to build things to extend the functionality around the radio, it's a lot easier to do it with the Flex because you can have several different clients talking over Ethernet to the radio, as opposed to most other radios where it all comes down to a serial port. And whether it's an RS-232 serial port or a virtual serial port over a cable, you still have one or two COM ports and that's it. And that means you can be talking typically to one thing or two things, and that's all. And since you have the availability of the Ethernet port on the FlexRadio, you can have all kinds of things talking to the radio. So like when we implemented the iShare radio, which is a cockpit for clubs to manage multiple users on the radio, we're another client that we could talk to the radio and monitor what's going on and adjust things accordingly and not take up the one serial port that's on the radio. So even if the user never really understands how any of that stuff works, it does make it for a better platform so that we can really have more extensibility to that system. So as you build out your remote station and you go from maybe a single user to you and your friends or you and your club, you want to add more functionality to that station. It really is a better platform for that expansion.
So George, we teased this in the last video that we shot, but there's so many clubs today that want to build a remote station, and because they have members that live somewhere, whether they live in a senior facility or something like that, they don't have antennas anymore, radios anymore, but they want to still be on the air, or someone who lives in an HOA, or God forbid, somebody who has spousal issues that, the spouse doesn't want antennas in the backyard, which is a totally foreign thought to me. But the bottom line is that, we teased iShare Radio before, but let's dig into that a little deeper, because I think this is really at the heart of making the club station really come together.
Yeah, this is something we observed in trying to set up our own club stations here. So as I mentioned before, you really need the radio and you need some stuff around the radio to manage a remote station. And for an individual, that's fine. You don't really need more than that. But when it comes to multi-user environments, then there's a bunch of additional headaches that kind of crop up. So let's say, for example, this is true, by the way, if I have a station and I'm just letting my couple of friends access it, it's the same thing as if I have a club with 100 members and I want everybody to be able to access it. I have the same set of headaches. And so one headache is I don't want to give my one login to 100 members of the club. I would, in a perfect world, I'd like everybody to have their own login. And when they log into the radio, wouldn't it be great if something would guide the radio's behavior to allow them to only operate the way that the administrator lets them? And that's really what iShare Radio does at the core. So for example, if you log into my FlexRadio, you can set it to any band and any power level and do whatever you want, whether there's even an antenna on it or not. So there's no way to really know that until you press the button and you find out the SWR is high. So with iShare Radio, the first thing we do is we can create a login for every single user which means from an administrator point of view, you can select who has access and who doesn't have access. And also we have a profile for every user, and it talks in the database, it tells you, you define what the privileges are. Like, for example, if I'm a technician, I could use 10 meters on sideband, but I can't use 80 meters. If I'm a general or an extra, I can use 80 meter sideband, but the subbands are different. So based on your license class, we will control the radio. And this gets back to what we just talked about with the Flex. Since you have access to the radio from our server, or our server does, then we can monitor what's going on. If you set the radio for a frequency to transmit on that you're not allowed to transmit on, we can intercept that and change it so we don't let you do that. So the first thing we do is we can constrain what it is the user's allowed to do so they don't make any mistakes. The second thing is we can use the system to schedule time, because how do you know when your time is on the radio? You need a calendar. Now you can have a Google Calendar or something like that, but what you really want is a way to formally block out time on the system. And as the admin, I want to be able to reserve time for club activities or maintenance periods or whatever, so I can prevent people from signing up. The third thing I want to be able to do is to turn the physical things on and off, change antennas, all the station controller stuff. I need to be able to get to that. So there's a station controller control panel built into it. And basically the whole notion of iShare Radio is it fills in all the gaps that are really missing to allow a radio like a Flex to be used as a shared resource. So it's a much more secure and controlled environment, which is better for the owners of the radio because they can control what goes on. But it's also better for the users because they can't inadvertently do something they're not allowed to do. So that's a plus for them. So they really can't hurt anything.
Yeah, that's really cool. And, I think really one of the neatest parts about this whole thing is that with our partnership with you, George, and our partnership with FlexRadio, Mike, you can this is literally a one-stop shop to come and buy your radio, your antennas, your controller, your whatever you need. And so I think that just makes this just awesome. And is there anything else before we wrap up today?
I think you hit the nail on the head, Mike. I think that the big change that I see, it's like a lot of technologies. When something first comes along, there's a few people who invent whatever the thing is, and they make it work for themselves, and that's all great. And everybody else just kind of sits back in awe, like, wow, that's amazing. But they don't have the time, or they don't have the technical background to do it. And so what we're seeing here in remote operation, between the radios becoming much more remotable and the availability of interconnectivity through the internet and satellites and so forth, and physical infrastructure like the station controller and iShare Radio, you bring all that together and it's all off the shelf, turnkey, and it just makes it all work the way you wish it had worked 20 years ago if it had existed. So now it's matured to the point where it's really an off the shelf solution. And I find that very exciting. I mean, we're using all this stuff in our own local clubs here, and it's just working great.
I love it when technology just works.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, George, Mike, thanks you guys for joining me today.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Mike.
And that wraps up this series on the Seirra Radio controller. I hope that you've enjoyed watching as much as I've enjoyed making it. You can find more information on the DX Engineering and Seirra Radio websites, and I'll leave links in the description. Thanks for watching. I'm Michael, KI@R. We'll catch you on the next one.